Hello. Welcome to a special episode of Gush Erupt Deconstruct. I am reflecting on my recording of episode 2. Not only does episode 2 kind of need a introduction all on its own, but I also think that I'm ready to get a couple things off my chest about experiences I had at FGCU, I would say about, 9 years ago. Never mind. I don't know when I lived. It's probably like 6 years ago. 7. 7 is the magic number. I would say 7 years ago. But before we get into that, I do want to, mention the elephant in the room. I have not shot an episode of my podcast by myself before. So if I'm boring you to tears, you need to let me know. You need to drop a comment or text me on the side and be like, wow, that was so boring and I feel bad for you. So please just inform me. Inform me after the fact. So if you follow me on Medium, I actually wrote an article recently, and it has to do with that second podcast episode. And I'm talking about diversity, the diversity movement, and how it kind of needs to evolve a little bit because it's pretty much stuck in a rut. And not only is it stuck in a rut, but we've seen a lot of opposition to it in certain places, right? I mean, we have in Florida, diversity initiatives are outlawed. In Texas, it's a similar situation. So there's a lot of states at this point. And it's easy to say that it's because, there's racism going on, or maybe these people, have an agenda, but also you could look at it from a different perspective, right? And I always like to look at things from a different perspective. That perspective could be that diversity initiatives have become exclusionary. Okay, if you think about it, white people are not included when you say diversity, especially when you are talking in a generic context. If you mention diversity to somebody on the street, they're not going to be thinking about a white person. So when you try to include them in diversity efforts, it sometimes feels like you're putting them in a corner, right? Because they don't really have a choice if you ask them, so are you pro-diversity or anti-diversity? Because if they say anti, there's going to be some sort of backlash. So I wrote this Medium article, and it was all about how diversity should differentiate itself from other movements, such as, critical race theory or anything like that. Something that, these states have said exists. And then I said to myself, does something like that exist? Have I seen critical race theory in action? And actually, I have. Well, the closest that I have seen or experienced critical race theory types of courses was at FGCU. I took a class called White Racism, and I just took it because honestly I needed like another 0.5 on my credits to make the whole math for my degree work, okay? And I thought it would be interesting. I really did. And while it was interesting, when I reflect on it, sometimes I think that it did more harm than good. And that is what my second podcast episode is about. Okay, I am inviting Griffin onto the podcast, and he had a strong reaction to the white racism course, and he actually ended up being, confronted by campus police about it. And I'm going to let you figure out how that happened and that whole story on the second episode, since I'm really here just expressing myself. But I do think that while my experience is in the past, it also is very much current. It's very much in the present. If you look at recent events, we have MIT, the iconic school MIT, is no longer requiring diversity questionnaires when they're hiring staff. They said that it wasn't effective, that whether you believed in diversity or not, that didn't make you a better professor, and it had absolutely nothing to do with your capability. We also have certain, I would say, viewpoints being stifled. Universities have stamped out pro-Palestinian protests on their university campus. They called in the police to bait the students who had this particular opinion that I think aligns with that thought process, So we are seeing all types of opposition to the diversity movement. So how can diversity become more educational and not so much, I would say, like a policy? Because when you incorporate diversity as a policy, it becomes something different. It becomes like a rule that everybody has to follow, or like a viewpoint that everybody has to hold. And I think that people, they're not feeling that anymore. They want to have their own opinion on things. They want to be able to express what's bad and good about something without suffering some sort of adverse reaction. So in my Medium article, I did include a really good example, I thought, of diversity working, because diversity often works very well in the private sector, right? I mean, you're not going to buy from a brand that's exclusionary. I don't know how many of you grew up with Abercrombie and Fitch, and the bags with the men with the six packs, which was great and wonderful to look at. But if you went into one of the stores and you didn't exactly look that way or have the potential of looking that way, it was exclusionary. And that's kind of what led to the fall of Abercrombie. And then they had to work their way back up, and they had to make it happen. And the way they made it happen was because they had to include everybody. They had to include, Asian people, black people, everybody, absolutely everybody in their fashion brand. They brought in a new CEO, somebody who, wasn't exclusionary. Exclusionary brands don't do very well anymore whatsoever. But what happens when you work in like the public sector, where whether or not you are accepting of different types of people has basically nothing to do with your day-to-day operations, and there is no financial incentive because you're not selling to a consumer. Can you still maintain these diversity policies? Well, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. If you have a movement that is supposed to be about including everyone, you can't really exclude groups of people. I've met a lot of different white people over the years, and they're not all the same. They're as diverse as any other group of people. Speaking of meeting white people at FGCU, I did meet some wild people. I had an encounter with a girl once where in class, she really said, you can't judge people for not knowing things, because when I was 10 years old, I saw my first black person. She says she was from New Hampshire, so I'm going to believe her. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt. And then she also said that she asked her mom, why are those people's skin so dirty? So I also believe her, because she seemed very genuine when she said that. But also, really, you never turned on BET at night and saw a hip hop music video? Be for real, ma'am. Be for real. But long story short, I do believe her. But when you meet, an American person from the North versus the South versus from LA versus from the Midwest, they're all different. They all have something unique to them. And really, the diversity movement needs to evolve to a place where white people are more included, where they're not, put on the outskirts or given a command and said, you have to think this way or else we're coming after you. Now, this relates to the episode with Griffin and the white racism course, because I felt like it was kind of wild. I mean, my 3 problems with it really were that it framed minorities as victims. That's what I saw. A lot of times the professor who I asked to be on an episode of this podcast, and he said no. But he did say the concept was cool, so I'll give him that. He would say that minorities and people of color were expected to perform these Herculean efforts. That's what he would say, that if they could just perform these Herculean efforts, that this was the outsider's point of view, that they would succeed. And he would always say that, the odds were stacked against them. But I don't really know what you get out of that viewpoint. I feel like you always want to come from a place of power, you being in control, and not blaming outside influences for your failure or for your success, right? you should be treasuring your autonomy. So I felt like that was something that was harmful that came from that course. Also, it really powered through the assumption that just white people are constantly sabotaging minorities every day, which I don't necessarily believe is true. I mean, there is some clunkiness. There's some clunkiness when someone is kind of interacting with a person of color and they're usually not interacting with us. And that's okay. I mean, I've come to accept it, and it's hilarious to watch, to be honest. It can be hilarious to experience. It can be dangerous to experience. There's all types of, nuance there, but I never want to jump to conclusions and say that, they're intentionally being malevolent or planning or plotting against me. That's not a fun way to live, if you ask me. It's not fun. I also thought that the course was, it kind of encouraged prejudice in a way. I mean, our final was wild. It was talking about how it was a debate. It was, should we surrender all white people on planet Earth to an alien race? And I was like, what? It was crazy. It really was crazy. So, long story short, I feel as if, I do need to introduce why I'm bringing Griffin onto the podcast to talk about his experience. Because if I don't, then it just exists in this awkward vacuum and y'all will not understand. But since part of this is me reflecting on some experiences, I thought it was important for you to hear my thoughts on this, especially because there's such a gap in between how I thought 7 years ago and how I think today. 7 years ago, I was happy to just sit in a chair and be happy that I was there. It's like, I'm happy to be here. I'm not going to express too many thoughts, although I think some people would say that I was outspoken 7 years ago. But at this point, maybe I've ascended to a new level of outspoken ridiculousness. I'm not sure. But I'm much less hesitant about embracing, contrarian thought. I love to see people do things in a different way or express a different view. And I don't know, that is exciting to me if they're coming from, a place of honesty. But you, of course, can check out my Medium piece where I go into much more detail about how diversity, equity, and inclusion can move forward. And I am also up for Mr. Health and Fitness 2024 through Muscle and Fitness magazine. So if you go to the link in my bio on my Instagram, it'd be very dope if you voted for me. So other than that, I can't wait for you to listen to episode 2 and let me know what you think. I was a little bit more nervous interviewing Griffin than I was on episode 1 because I don't know him as well. But please let me know if this was boring to you and tragic, because if that's the case, then I will continue to have a steady stream of guests. But if you were entertained listening to me, I also need to know that. All right. Peace out, and I will not see you, but you'll hear me on the next one.